with my knowledge, be cruelly visited upon him. It shall not indeed." With this emphatic repetition of his concluding words, the young lord turned upon his heel, but before he had reached the adjoining room, he turned back again, and said, with even greater vehemence than he had displayed before, "I do believe now, upon my honour, I do believe that the sister is as virtuous and modest a young lady as she is a handsome one. And of the brother I say this, that he acted as her brother should, and in a manly and spirited manner, and I only wish with all my heart and soul that any one of us came out of this manner half as well as he does." So saying, Lord Frederick Verisopht walked out of the room, leaving Sir Ralph Nickleby and Sir Mulberry in most unpleasant astonishment. "Is this your pupil?" asked Ralph softly, "or has he come fresh from some country parson?" "Green fools take these fits sometimes," replied Sir Mulberry Hawk, biting his lip and pointing to the door. "Leave him to me." Ralph exchanged a familiar look with his old acquaintance, for they had suddenly grown confidential again in this alarming surprise, and he took his way home thoughtfully and slowly. While these things were being said and done, and long before they were concluded, the omnibus had disgorged Miss Nickleby and her escort, and they had arrived at her own door. Now, the good nature of the little miniature painter would by no means allow of Smike's walking back again until he had been previously refreshed with just a sip of something comfortable and a mixed biscuit or so, and Smike, entertaining no objection either to the sip of something comfortable or the mixed biscuit, but considering on the contrary that they would be a very pleasant preparation for a walk to Bow, it fell out that he delayed much longer than he originally intended, and that it was some half hour after dusk when he set forth on his journey home. There was no likelihood of his losing his way, for it lay quite straight before him, and he walked into town with Nicholas and back alone almost every day. So Miss Nickleby and he shook hands with mutual confidence, and being charged with more kind remembrances to Mrs. and Miss Nickleby, Smike started off. At the foot of Ludgate Hill he turned a little out of the road to satisfy his curiosity by having a look at Newgate. After staring up at the sombre walls from the opposite side of the way, with great care and dread for some minutes, he turned back again into the old track and walked briskly through the city, stopping now and then to gaze in at the window of some particularly attractive shop, then running for a little way, then stopping again, and so on, as any other country lad might do. He had been gazing for a long time through a jeweller's window, wishing he could take some of the beautiful trinkets home as a present, and imagining what delight they would afford if he could, when the clocks struck 8:75. Roused by the sound, he hurried on at a very quick pace, and was crossing the corner of a by-street, when he felt himself violently brought to, with a jerk so sudden that he was obliged to cling to a lamp-post to save himself from falling. At the same moment a small boy clung tight round his leg, and a shrill cry of "Here he is, father! Hooray!" vibrated in his ears. Smike knew that voice too well. He cast his despairing eyes downward towards the form from which it had proceeded, and, shuddering from head to foot, looked round. Mr. Squeers had hooked him in the coat-collar with the handle of his umbrella, and was hanging on at the other end with all his might and main. The cry of triumph proceeded from Master Wackford, who, regardless of all his kicks and struggles, clung to him with the tenacity of a bulldog. One glance showed him this, and in that one glance the terrified creature became utterly powerless and unable to utter a sound. "Here's a go!" cried Mr. Squeers, gradually coming hand over hand down the umbrella, and only unhooking it when he had got tight hold of the victim's collar. "Here's a delicious go! Wackford, my boy, call up one of them coaches." "A coach, father?" cried little Wackford. "Yes, a coach, sir," replied Squeers, feasting his eyes upon the countenance of Smike. "Damn the expense! Let's have him in a coach." "What's he been a-doing of?" asked a labourer with a hod of bricks, against whom and a fellow labourer Mr. Squeers had backed on the first jerk of the umbrella. "Everything," replied Mr. Squeers, looking fixedly at his old pupil in a sort of rapturous trance. "Everything. Running away, sir, joining in bloodthirsty attacks upon his master. There's nothing that's bad that he hasn't done. Oh, what a delicious go is in this here, good Lord!" The man looked from Squeers to Smike, but such mental faculties as the poor fellow possessed had utterly deserted him. The coach came up. Master Wackford entered. Squeers pushed in his prize, and following close at his heels, pulled up the glasses. The coachman mounted his box and drove slowly off, leaving the two bricklayers and an old apple-woman and a town-made little boy returning from an evening school, who had been the only witnesses of the scene, to meditate upon it at their leisure. Mr. Squeers sat himself down on the opposite seat to the unfortunate Smike, and planting his hands firmly on his knees, looked at him for some 5 minutes, when, seeming to recover from his trance, he uttered a loud laugh, and slapped his old pupil's face several times, taking the right and left sides alternately. "It isn't a dream," said Squeers. "That's real flesh and blood. I know the feel of it." And being quite assured of his good fortune by these experiments, Mr. Squeers administered a few boxes on the ear, lest the entertainment should seem to partake of sameness, and laughed louder and longer at every one. "Your mother will be fit to jump out of her skin, my boy, when she hears of this," said Squeers to his son. "How won't she though, father?" replied Master Wackford. "To think," said Squeers, "that you and me should be turning out of a street and come upon him at the very nick, and that I should have him tight at only one cast of the umbrella, as if I'd hooked him with a grappling iron. Ha, ha, ha!" "Didn't I catch hold of his leg neither, father?" said little Wackford. "You did, like a good 'un, my boy," said Mr. Squeers, patting his son's head. "And you shall have the best button-over jacket and waistcoat that the next new boy brings down as a reward of merit. Mind that. You always keep on in the same path, and do them things that you see your father do, and when you die you'll go right slap to heaven and no questions asked." Improving the occasion in these words, Mr. Squeers patted his son's head again, and then patted Smike's, but harder, and inquired in a bantering tone how he found himself by this time. "I must go home," replied Smike, looking wildly around. "Oh, to be sure you must. You're about right there," replied Mr. Squeers. "You'll go home very soon, you will. You'll find yourself at the peaceful village of Dotheboys in Yorkshire in something under a week's time, my young friend, and the next time you get away from there, I give you leave to keep away. Where's the clothes you run off in, you ungrateful robber?" said Mr. Squeers in a severe voice. Smike glanced at the neat attire which the care of Nicholas had provided for him, and wrung his hands. "Do you know that I could hang you up outside of the Old Bailey for making away with them articles of property?" said Squeers. "Do you know that it's a hanging matter, and I ain't quite certain from where it ain't a anatomy one besides, to walk off with upwards of a value of £5 from a dwelling-house? Eh? Do you know that? What do you suppose was the worth of them clothes you had? Do you know that Wellington boot you wore cost 28 shillings when it was a pair, and the shoes 7 and 6? But you came to the right shop for mercy when you came to me, and thank your stars as it is me as has got to serve you with the article." Anybody not in Mr. Squeers's confidence would have supposed that he was quite out of article in question, instead of having a large stock on hand ready for all comers. Nor would the opinion of sceptical persons have undergone much alteration when he followed up the remark by poking Smike in the chest with the ferrule of his umbrella, and dealing a smart shower of blows with the ribs of the same instrument upon his head and shoulders. "I never threshed a boy in an hackney coach before," said Mr. Squeers when he stopped to rest. "There's inconvenience in it, but the novelty gives it a sort of relish too." Poor Smike! He warded off the blows as well as he could, and now shrunk into a corner of the coach with his head resting upon his hands and his elbows on his knees. He was stunned and stupefied, and had no more idea that any act of his would enable him to escape from the all-powerful Squeers, now that he had no friend to speak to or to advise with, than he had had in all the weary years of his Yorkshire life which preceded the arrival of Nicholas. The journey seemed endless. Street after street was entered and left behind, and still they went jolting on. At last Mr. Squeers began to thrust his head out of the window every half-minute, and to bawl a variety of directions to the coachman, and after passing with some difficulty through several mean streets which the appearance of the houses and the bad state of the road denoted to have been recently built, Mr. Squeers suddenly tugged at the check